Hello, good afternoon. I'm Abby Wolf, the Executive Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. And on behalf of Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. and all of us at the Hutchins Center, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this space for John Thornton's Du Bois virtual lecture this afternoon, a rare event on a Wednesday afternoon. So we're so pleased to have John with us today. During the lecture, please write your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We ask that you keep them brief so that we can incorporate as many as possible. We anticipate having many. Now it's my pleasure to say a few words about Alejandro De La Fuente, who will introduce Professor Thornton's lecture this afternoon. Alejandro De La Fuente is Robert Woods Bliss Professor of Latin American History and Economics, Professor of African and African American Studies and of History, Director of Graduate Studies. I'm not sure what department that is. I'm sorry. And I didn't write that down. And most importantly for us, he's the director of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at the Hutchins Center, all at Harvard University. A historian of Latin America and the Caribbean who specializes in the study of comparative slavery and race relations, Professor De La Fuente's works on race, slavery, law, art, and Atlantic history have been published in Spanish, English, Portuguese, Italian, German, and French. He is the author of Becoming Free, Becoming Black, Race, Freedom, and Law in Cuba, Virginia, and Louisiana, which was co-authored with Ariela J. Gross, Havana and the Atlantic in the 16th century, and of A Nation for All, Race, Inequality, and Politics in 20th Century Cuba, which was the winner of the Southern Historical Association's 2003 prize for Best Book in Latin American History. He is the co-editor with George Reed Andrews of Afro-Latin American Studies and Introduction, published by Cambridge University Press, and available also in Spanish and Portuguese, and of the Afro-Latin America book series from Cambridge University Press. Professor De La Fuente is also a curator, and his 3 exhibits have been featured at the Hutchins Center: Queloides, Race and Racism in Cuban Contemporary Art, Drapetomania, Grupo Antillano and the Art of Afro-Cuba, and Diago, The Pasts of this Afro-Cuban Present. Professor De La Fuente, as I mentioned, is the founding director of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at the Hutchins Center and the faculty chair of the Cuba Studies program at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. He is also the senior editor of the journal Cuban Studies and served for 5 years as the editor of Transition magazine, also at the Hutchins Center. Please join me now in welcoming Alejandro De La Fuente to the W.E.B. Du Bois virtual lecture series this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby, for your kind introduction and for the opportunity to introduce a dear colleague and somebody who is really part of the Hutchins Center family. And I don't mean this in a literary sense, I mean this in a rather literal sense. Every summer, I'm used to seeing John and Linda around the Hutchins Center somewhere in the 4th floor. That, of course, changed last year, but we're very much looking forward, John, to having you again around maybe next year and in years to come. Professor Thornton is Professor of African American Studies and Professor of History, and Director of Grad Studies in African American Studies at Boston University, which a university that he joined in 2003. And he has actually been associated with the Du Bois Institute pretty much since then, as a research, as a non-resident fellow, sometimes as a resident fellow, and as a research associate and collaborator. Whenever a question arises at the Hutchins Center about anything having to do with Africa, the first reaction is, let's call John and Linda and ask them. I think Professor Thornton would define himself primarily as an Africanist, but I think there is some justice in having somebody like me, a Latin Americanist or an Afro-Latin Americanist, introducing him, given how many important contributions he has done to the study of slavery, race, culture in the Americas. He is the author of The Kingdom of Kongo, Civil War and Transition, 1641-1718, published in 1983. Africa and Africans in the Formation of the Atlantic World, 1400-1680, in the first edition of 1992. That book then in the second edition of 98 covered the 18th century as well. The Congolese Saint Anthony, Dona Beatriz Kimpa Vita, and the Antonian Movement, 1684-1706. Warfare in Atlantic Africa, 1500-1800. And in 2007, with Linda Heywood, he published Central Africans, Atlantic Creoles, and the Foundation of the Americas, published by Cambridge University Press, a book that, by the way, won the Herskovits Prize that year. And his most recent book, A Cultural History of the Atlantic World, 1350-1820, also published by Cambridge University Press, won the World History Association's Prize for Best New Book in World History in 2012. Professor Thornton has, as I said, has been linked to the Hutchins Center for many years. He has served as co-director, along with Professor Heywood, of the Hutchins Center Central African Diaspora to the Americas project. And he has been a consultant to every major exhibit, series, documentary that has been produced about Africa and about Afro-diasporic issues during the last several decades, including working closely with our own Skip Gates, with Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. as consultant in his genealogy series, in some of his films, such as Black in Latin America and Africa's Great Civilizations. But I wanted to say something personal about John and about his scholarship, and about the influence that he has had on historians who, like me, were in grad school in the 1990s, just as his Africa and Africans in the Formation of the Atlantic World was published. I think his body of work in general, and this book in particular, have been transformational in several ways. And this is not a term I would use lightly. First, I think Professor Thornton, in some ways, taught new generations of scholars of slavery, the slave trade, colonialism, and culture in Latin America that we could not really do that work without paying, without learning about Africa and about African societies. He forced us to incorporate African societies into our own work. And I have to say that we knew nothing about African societies at the time, because that was a different discipline. It was not really, it was not something that one would learn in traditional programs on Latin American history. He also placed Africans into broader scholarly debates and approached the history of Africa with what I would describe as Brodelian sensibilities. There is something of Annales schools in his work and all the work he has done on African societies. He can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but as an admirer myself of the Annales schools, I see a lot of crossings there. In the process, he has made important contributions, not only to African historiography. He helped transform Atlantic historiography, Atlantic studies, and Afro-diasporic historiography as well. Because as he has stated, you cannot really study African societies without paying serious attention to the slave trade and its impact on the Americas. Some of the best scholars of Atlantic Africa, of the slave trade, and of slavery in the New World, I don't know, from James Sweet to Roquinaldo Ferreira or Mariana Candido to Manuel Barcia, would credit John Thornton as a source of inspiration. As a scholar of slavery and of Afro-Latin American cultural formations, I also count myself among those who have been inspired and influenced by John, given his contributions to important and enduring debates about Creolization in the Americas. When the first edition of Africa and Africans came out in 1992, I was in grad school. And it was one of those rare books that immediately makes it into seminar reading lists. You know, it was one of these books that people began to talk about and that everybody had to read. But I think perhaps even more important than that is the fact that almost 30 years later, I continue to use that book. I use the 1998 edition. I never miss that book in my courses on comparative slavery. It's perhaps the only book from the 90s that is still always in that reading list. And that is saying something about the enduring influence of scholarship, of Professor Thornton's scholarship. He will speak today on religion, the Kingdom of Congo, and the slave trade as part of the W.E.B. Du Bois virtual lecture series. And I am honored to introduce today a colleague from whom I have learned so much. So please join me in welcoming Professor Thornton this afternoon. And with that, I give the virtual floor to you, John. Welcome.
Thank you, Alejandro, for that very generous introduction. And thanks also to all the folks at the Hutchins Center, but especially to Skip, Henry Louis Gates Jr., and to Abby for inviting me to do this lecture and catching me at a time when I feel like I've got something new to say. So I'll leave it at that and just say that the topic, I'm going to share my screen now so we can all enjoy this together. Where did it go? Here it is. Okay. This is not what I'm expecting. Okay. That's got to go. Okay, well, hopefully we'll do better than we did on that start. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is about the general process of how African religions come to the Americas and what their fates are and how they adjust to this new environment on the other side of the ocean. But I'm going to spend a lot of my time talking about what we know now about African religions, their characteristics, and some of their historical examples and how they developed over time. I'm going to spend quite a bit of my time focusing on the specific religion of Voodoo in Haiti, primarily because the documentation that we have on the African side supports a better look at the impact of the Kingdom of Dahomey and its neighboring areas on Haiti than it does for the Yoruba, who also have a big role to play in African religions in the Americas. So I'm going to start by that and say one of the keys or cores of my historical research over the years has been the Kingdom of Congo, which is notable in particular for having converted to Christianity the year before Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1491. And so increasingly, I've come to recognize that the fact that the Kingdom of Congo was a Christian and a Catholic country, and that it contributed mightily, thanks to its civil wars, to the population of the African American world, that it has a role to play that's outsized relative to even its general contribution to the population. Actually, the idea that the Kingdom of Congo was important in bringing at least Christianity with it to the Americas came out of a conference that Linda Heywood organized at Howard University back in 1999, which was called Bantu into Black. Cambridge University Press thought better to transfer that succinct phrase into this awkward title. And in that particular conference and in the book that followed, Terry Ray and Hein van Hey both presented papers, I think independently of each other, in which in one way or another they proposed that the development of the Catholic Church in Haiti owed a lot to the Kingdom of Congo's Christianity. And that was a really important component. I was taken by that discussion, particularly because I was a part of the same journal or the same conference, but not doing that particular topic. And so in 2016, I published my first attempt to get the Congolese to bring the saints to Santeria. That paper on Cuba was, yeah, that paper on Cuba was for me an interesting part of the discussion, which was to understand that it was quite probably the Congolese Catholics who introduced Yoruba slaves, for example, to Christianity much more than the colonial church. And I'm now extending that and trying to take a look at that process in other parts of the Caribbean. So let me just say that we can start with the Kingdom of Congo. Here it is in Central Africa. This is a relatively detailed map. And if you can imagine, this is the west coast of Africa, and that most of what you're seeing is now in Angola. So what I want to do is, first of all, make sure that we understand what exactly happened in the Kingdom of Congo in the 15th century, because it's relevant for how this is going to develop forward. The Kingdom of Congo was not a colony of anybody. It didn't become a colony or a part of the colony of Angola until the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century. It developed independent of political influence from outside the country. Secondly, it was also not exactly what we would call a missionary religion conversion. By that, I mean, it wasn't something that the Portuguese came and planted some missionaries there, and over time they built up a following of people who became Christian or something like that. That's sort of the model that we get from the colonial period, the small group of missionaries coming in and spreading the faith. Rather, it was from the very beginning, it was a Congolese project. In 1487, they sent a high-stakes, high-ranks embassy to Portugal. And that embassy was led by people of the highest Congolese nobility. They stayed in Portugal for a year and a half. And while they were there, they stayed at the Church of St. John the Evangelist, where they were entertained for a year and a half by Vicente dos Anjos, who was a priest of that order. And one of the things that he did was he taught them to speak Portuguese, and they taught him to speak Kikongo, their language. In the process, according to Dos Anjos' biography, in the process, they learned about Christianity and decided to be baptized themselves. They then returned to Congo in 1491, and immediately, the Congolese elite converted. The priests that they brought with them were primarily there to perform the sacraments. The original chronicle doesn't even talk about any sort of educational process that the priests might have performed. Following that, the kings of Congo took the process of spreading Christianity into their own hands. Not so much the first Christian king, João Zinganku, but rather his son, Alfonso Mbemba Nzinga, became the sort of apostle of Congo, as in fact one of the Portuguese writers of the time said. His process was to develop a whole series of lay ministers who were school teachers. In Portuguese language correspondence in Congo, they're called mestres de escola, or school teachers. Here you see an 18th century depiction of two of these mestres going out on their job. Alfonso describes this happening already in 1516 when he had a school built in his country, and the first graduates were already going out into the countryside. By 1530, they had formed a network in the entire country. And an Inquisition document from 1584 tells us that the priests who came to the country from outside did not do any instruction, because that was already being done by natives of the country, prominent men who engaged in their education. That structure of mestres de escola that was spread throughout the country remained in place right through until the beginning of the colonial period. Witnesses from the 19th century talk about the mestres de escola still being there, still teaching. People who visited the country from outside would say there's been a place that hasn't seen an ordained priest in 30 or 40 years. The people still knew all the songs, they had all the prayers, they knew the gestures of the faith, they wore crucifixes and so on. I want to stress this because I know there's a lot of people who are saying, well, you know, this was superficial, it was just confined to the nobility, and so on. This is simply not true. What happens, though, was that, unfortunately, Alfonso hoped that his country would become a fully recognized Christian country, specifically with its own bishop, who would then ordain its own citizens as priests. I can't go into the details of all this, but the Portuguese were able to prevent that from happening. And as a result, Congo had a very difficult time getting any clergy, and especially getting their own clergy. This was a large political issue. Ultimately, the Congolese got around this by appealing directly to the Vatican and having missionaries come to Congo to serve as priests. These missionaries were chosen to be Italians and of the Capuchin order, primarily because the Spanish king and the Portuguese king and the King of Congo had to agree on somebody that was neutral in any political disputes. And so the Capuchins are responsible for telling us a great deal about the Kingdom of Congo. They wrote thousands, maybe I think even tens of thousands of pages of text about Congo in the 17th and 18th century. It's certainly our primary source, the most detailed sources that we have about the history of the country. But these guys were also the foot soldiers of the Catholic Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, as you might call it. And one of their jobs had been in Europe and everywhere else in the world to crush what had been the medieval Christian church. The medieval Christian church in particular had a large group of sort of folk beliefs and magical beliefs that surfaced just below the regular Christian communities, and they went after that particular form of the religion. They met something very much like that in Congo, and they went after it there too. So their accounts are often negative in the sense that they describe them as being weak Christians or poor Christians, precisely because they continue to follow a lot of these, what I would call local traditions that were associated with a pre-existing Congolese church. And so it gave them, if you will, a bad reputation, because although the Capuchin priests' primary role in the Kingdom of Congo was actually sacramental rather than educational. They did do education, but there weren't very many of them. They didn't educate that many people, but they did a lot of sacraments. They did tens of thousands of baptisms and thousands of marriages. And that's primarily what they were there to do. But it gave the Congo a reputation which has passed into modern historiography of being a country that really wasn't a particularly strongly Christian country or a Catholic country. So what I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit about the nature of the Christianity in the Kingdom of Congo, and especially to talk about what we would consider the traditional religion which Christianity overlaid. When Linda organized the conference that I just mentioned, Bantu into Black, she gave me the assignment of trying to figure out what the base religion of West Central Africa was, using contemporary sources and other types of sources. So what I did to do this was a couple things. First of all, I took very detailed descriptions that were fortunately in the record of the Kingdom of Luango, which lay to the north of Congo. Here you see it. This was an area that spoke the same Kikongo language, but was never Christianized. And we have a really good 17th century description of their religious traditions that was done by a man named Abraham Valarch, who was a Dutch fine artist that came to Angola in 1641 with an explicit mission of documenting the customs of the people in the country. His work was published then by Alfred Dapper in 1668. And so he took the trouble to sort of ask people a lot of questions and then although he was a Christian and thought maybe they were a little diabolical, he did describe the religion fairly well. I also used the work of Antonio Cavazzi, who worked in this region. Again, not so much because Cavazzi was anything special, except that he did write a lot about the local religion. So I tried to sort of combine those things together. I added to that the denunciations that the Capuchin missionaries made about the customs that were still surviving in the Kingdom of Congo. And then finally, I added the work of modern ethnographers, both European ethnographers, and Congo has a fairly strong tradition of what I call self-ethnographers, people who are from the country who write treatises on their religious tradition. So bundling all that together, I came up with a picture of what we might call the traditional West Central African religion. Okay, so let me just run down what that would involve. So first of all, I have to say that like other religions of Africa, the religion of West Central Africa was continuously revealed. This is a term which I coined in African Africans to describe the way in which religious knowledge reached people. It didn't reach people through what I call a discontinuous revelation, which would be a major religious event like the delivery of the scriptures. Typically, discontinuous revelations are scriptural traditions. Or they have fixed memorized texts, like, for example, the Rig Veda during its pre-literate period, or the Buddhist writings before those were set down. It's possible that they can be translated verbatim that way, but that kind of tradition wasn't really found in Africa. Instead, people expected the other world, the spiritual world, to reveal itself to them on a continuous basis, not necessarily in big dramatic events, but in a massive number of small events. When people went to ask the other world for a petition of some kind or another, was that delivered to them? Were they able to protect themselves from their enemies, for example, by requesting this from the other world? Because it was continuously revealed, it didn't have a strong dogma of its own. It wasn't a tradition that insisted that certain types of things be done or certain places were sacred. Rather, those places could easily come and go, depending on whatever happened. So it could be that the spiritual power that was once found in this grove of trees is no longer there for reasons we don't know. And so that's what we get. So in this particular environment, we find is, first of all, there is some concept of a divine, of a higher God. In this case, the discovery of this higher God named him Zambia Mpungu. In all of this region, Zambia is one of the terms for God. And he is, however, or it is, however, a remote force, which doesn't have any special attributes. People didn't pay much attention to it before the Christian era. And in many cases, many scholars have argued that it's not really clear that what is called the sort of remote deity of Africa was in fact originally a deity at all, but became one through influence of Christianity. The big, if we want to say divine sort of higher level spiritual entities that we find in this area, these were typically what I would call tutelary spirits or territorial gods, whose worship might be fixed on a shrine somewhere. We know that Luango, for example, and Congo too, was covered with shrines which protected a particular valley or maybe a mountainside or a section of the plain. And people knew what the god's territory was, and that god was responsible for the weather, for fertility of the soil, for the general goodwill of the inhabitants. Those type of deities, I'm going to call them deities and gods, coexisted with the cult of the ancestors. The idea that when people die, their souls go somewhere in the other world. But what's significant about them is that their souls in the other world have power in this world. And they use that power to help and sometimes to punish their descendants. And so this ancestral idea was very much there. The Catholic Church in Congo incorporated at least part of that ancestor into the celebration of All Souls Day or All Saints Day, where they would hold a midnight vigil at the graves of their ancestors over what we would call Halloween today. And then in the morning, they would come and say Mass on behalf of them. And that wasn't, of course, the only way they propitiated their ancestors, but it was the way it got incorporated into Christianity. In addition to that, we also had a lot of what I guess we could call relatively minor spiritual entities. They weren't the big territorial gods, but they were minor spiritual entities who were not necessarily assigned to any particular place or people. They may have been the souls of some people who got lost from their ancestral stages, or just souls that were naturally found in nature. And these particular entities, however, while they might not be very significant cosmologically, they're very significant in terms of people's daily life. And what would happen typically is that a person who had the capacity to work with those spirits, oftentimes it meant to be possessed by those spirits, would make some kind of a spiritual receptacle. Sometimes these are called amulets. They were called fetishes sometimes. They might be called charms. These are all terms that are used for them. I like sort of spiritual vessel. And typically some kind of spirit would be captured or enticed to live in that vessel, and it would provide protection or whatever the person who made it intended for it to do. And there were recipes for these things. Here are some religious medals. These are the kind of things that a Christian might have, but typically these would also be mixed with things that the missionaries would have considered to be pagan or superstitious or even diabolical. Other ingredients which are put together in assemblages. And I want to sort of recognize here the work of Cécile Froment and Matthew Rary, who have been talking about assemblages as particularly in the concept of the Bolsa of Mandinga. It's one of the various types of assemblages that we find elsewhere in the Atlantic world, in which sacred objects and then also special objects which are going to have specific ways to capture particular types of spirits are placed into some sort of physical object. It doesn't have to be a pouch like a Bolsa de Mandinga. It could be a small a physical item. It could be what people might have called an idol, or any manner of other kinds of things. And these were the things that people used to help them in their daily lives. And even though they're not, as I said before, terribly important from a theological point of view, they do play a big role in what people are doing. Okay, so this is sort of a quick background to what we meet in West Central Africa. But as a part of my larger project for this, I wanted to take a look at the rest of the African coast and take a look at what other kinds of religious traditions we meet there. And let me just say up front that the Central African model matches very well what we meet everywhere else. There's only one place in this region where there's a sharp and interesting divergence. Well, two really. One of them is, of course, the Islamic region up here, and the other is this, what I'm going to call the Yoruba Fon or Fon Yoruba tradition here, which breaks the mold a little bit, and I'll describe how that takes place. Okay, so first of all, I start with this. One of the reasons I started with the Akan region over here is because we have good descriptions of the Akan region. There were European posts on the coast. A number of curious people asked a lot of questions. And although many of them were rather superficial, we do have quite a few pretty detailed descriptions, which gives us a 17th and 18th century anchor point for what we think the religions look like in this area. In the Akan region, there was a remote deity, which most of the observers reported was named Yakompong, or forms similar to that. There was a cult of ancestors, and there were shrines, notable shrines. One of the things that's distinctive about shrines here, as elsewhere in Africa, is their localism. They're confined to a particular area. I take as an example of that a German visitor working for the Danish West India Company, a man by the name of Frederick Römer, was a very curious guy about religion, and he asked a lot of questions, and he befriended a local priest named Putti, and he asked him a lot of questions about religion, and he reported these questions sort of straightforwardly, even though he thought sometimes they were ridiculous and he denounced them and so on, he still reported them for us. He asked Römer a specific question about a shrine that was not at Accra, where he was located, but was in the Fante country. This was probably the shrine of Nanompal, the sort of national shrine of the Fante people. And he asked Putti if Nanompal could actually have his own, the territorial deity that Putti served, could he lift an ox up into the air and rotate him around? And Putti said, "Oh, it's ridiculous. My shrine can't do that." No, no. To do that, you'll have to go to Fante, which is to say, you couldn't get Fante to come to there, and you had to go to that spot. And this is what I found in the pattern which I looked at, was this idea that while territorial deities might have considerable power over an area, it's really confined to just that area. It doesn't work very far anywhere else. I spent some time also taking a look at this region here. Again, finding very much the same pattern that I just described for us. I used in this case the work of Alvaro Velho, a 15th century observer who gave us a lot of information on local practices, including about shrines and territorial deities. And also the Jesuit writers who came there in the 17th century, who also were very curious about things and asked a lot of questions and reported the answers. I do want to also mention, of course, the Islamic region. Now, Islam obviously has a different take. Traditionally, the Gambia River here was kind of the border between the Islamic world and the non-Islamic world. There were plenty of Muslims that lived south of here, but they generally tended to stay to themselves, and they weren't big on proselytizing until later in the history of the area. For them, the merger of Islam and local religion was, first of all, of course, the high deity. Whatever high deity there might be immediately became Allah, no problem there. With regards to the shrine type deities or the territorial deities, of course, there's no place in Islam for a territorial deity. So they sort of found one. And there were two possibilities for this. One of these was the cult of the Jinn. So the Jinn are supernatural beings that are recognized in Islam. In fact, there's one surah in the Quran that's actually for the Jinn. And there's 2 or 3 other surahs that are directed to both people and Jinn. So there's no question about the existence of the Jinn. And essentially what West Africans that practiced Islam did was they often transferred what had once been a territorial deity into the Jinn. When Islamic reformers began working in this region in the 19th century, they denounced this practice and said people were worshiping the Jinn. Nevertheless, if you go to Senegal or Mali today, you'll find that the Jinn are still very much active in that area. Another way that they replaced the territorial deity with something Islamic was through Sufism. So many of the Sufi mystics, sheikhs as they're called, were held to have a special power called baraka, blessing, which allowed them to perform miracles. When they died, their baraka lingered around their graves. And very often, we read this from contemporary chronicles in the 17th and 18th century, many times they would occupy a traditional location, and their grave would be where the old shrine had been. It wasn't always that way, but that often happened. And so they too, pilgrimages to their baraka was not infinite. You had to go to their actual grave to get the baraka. Okay, and likewise, the ancestors continued as well. Islam doesn't really have a prohibition or a statement about what ancestors can do after their death. And so that's sort of a loophole that allowed the ancestors to kind of sneak in. Reformers, again, took this on in the 19th century, but in the period we're talking about, the ancestors were very much a part of Islam. So I have left out one region, and that's this one here. And the reason for that is because, unlike the others, the Yoruba and Fon had a higher level of deity that claimed to be mobile, that could move from one place to another, and potentially could even be universal. And this is going to give them the capacity to cross the Atlantic Ocean. So our earliest this is the shrine of Nampampo, which I was mentioning before. Got ahead of myself. Shrines, and here's what I really want to get to. The other one was a shrine in Liberia. Same sort of stories we talked about with shrines. So some of the early descriptions of the Kingdom of Vita, which you see here at the top of this, mention that they had a very powerful deity that the earlier descriptions just called a snake god. And you see that the god is actually this snake right here, and he has a little snake house that he lives in. There were snake houses all over Vita and its neighboring territories as well. It's interesting that the Whetans, when they were speaking with the author of this text, which is the Chevalier de Marché, when they told him the stories about the snake, they said it had originated in another country and it actually migrated to them in the course of a battle. And interestingly enough, this same snake deity was subject to problems, let's say, when Dahomey took over Vita in 1727. The soldiers in the Dahomeyan army were so scornful of the snake that they actually killed and roasted and ate all of the sacred snakes that they could meet in Vita. But it wasn't that long before it turns out that Vita's snake had become the god of Dahomey as well. I think this process took place because King Agaja, who was the leader of that campaign in 1727, told people that he had a personal deity that protected him, that told him what to do, that helped him to understand law. He doesn't name that deity. And in fact, as far as we can see, he didn't ever take the snake deity as his own. But we do know that one of his successors, Tebesu, had taken as his personal deity a god which he called Gun. And what's interesting about that is also not a local god. Ogun comes from Yoruba. So a Yoruba god had come into this country. Actually, there's a story that this deity had been brought there by a priest of Ogun who had come to Dahomey. Presumably, it's a mythical story, so it could have been any time, but the story was told in the 1790s. And the king of Dahomey had taken him on as his personal deity. And then when the kingdom of Oyo, the rulers of the Yorubas, demanded that the priest come back, they had a long negotiation. And finally, they said they cut the priest in half, and one half went to Oyo, and the other half stayed in Dahomey. His successor, Adandazan, however, did not choose to stay with Gun, but chose instead a god he called Leba. And he wrote several letters in which he mentions, my god Leba, my god Leba. And again, this is Elegua, the Yoruba god. So Yoruba deities were penetrating this region as well. So what I'm understanding or trying to figure out from this is that clearly this particular cultural region has a mobile up group, a higher group in the hierarchy of the other world that is mobile. How universal it is maybe isn't very clear, but it can move from one place to another, can be worshipped in two places at the same time, doesn't have to be confined to a single shrine. And that's what we see with the snake god the first time we meet descriptions of that situation. Okay, so this leaves us now to contemplate for a minute what happens to Africans from these various religious environments as they cross over the Atlantic Ocean and come to the New World. Well, for most of them, they will have left virtually all spiritual help behind them. Their ancestors are buried in their graves back in Africa. The territorial deities which might have given them fertility and wealth and weather and so on, they're also local. They're not crossing the ocean. They're staying back in Africa as well. And so they're coming to an environment where basically they have no idea what the spiritual universe is going to be like. But they suspect, and this is my speculation obviously, they suspect that there will be local deities of one kind or another. There'll probably be territorial deities there, and there may very well be those helpful, lesser spiritual entities which can be captured in receptacles and held as amulets and so on. The task will simply be to locate them. They're not expecting to find anything African over here, but they're going to find something that they can use. Well, one of the things, of course, they almost always realized was that there were clearly shrines. There was a shrine god in the Americas, and his name was Jesus or God, and he lived in a church. In Protestant countries, those who went to Protestant countries quickly discovered that very often Protestants did not want to share this deity with them. They wouldn't allow them to be baptized. They wouldn't allow them to come to church, which doesn't mean that they necessarily rejected it. They simply thought, okay, that's not for us. Maybe we can access that at some point, but right now that's not for us. So in areas like Jamaica, in particular, I'm just using that as an example, essentially what they did was they turned to people among them who were capable of capturing or using local deities and made them into locally useful things. And we have essentially a tradition like that of Obia. So Obia doesn't recognize gods. It doesn't recognize territorial deities, as far as we can see. There in some Jamaican texts from this period, we do hear Yankompong, the high god of the Akan, being mentioned. But basically, what they're using is the local spiritual entities. And we can see from, for example, the documentation about Obia men, people who had the skill to be able, or the capacity to be possessed and to be able to capture and rotate or use those local spiritual entities to their own ends. And so oftentimes a person could be convicted of Obia if they possessed certain types of objects, alligator teeth, cat's paws, and interestingly enough, thunderstones. So I mentioned thunderstones because it's come to me through the work of Amara Thornton, who is an archaeologist or historian of archaeology, and she's been doing work on the collection of indigenous archaeological objects by collectors living in the West Indies in the 18th and 19th centuries. And among their many discoveries were what are called in those days thunderstones. What they actually are is they're Carib or Arawak or Taino religious objects that have been excavated. She found this out from her research, excavated often by the Africans for the purposes of using these Obia stuff. And so the thunderstones are interesting because this gives you a real clear idea that they're looking for the local territorial entities. They're looking for the local entities at all. And they're presuming that the original inhabitants of this region who are represented archaeologically are also the people who they can contact. So having thunderstones in there, and it turns out they're all over the Caribbean. When you look at these kinds of religious packages where they're mentioned or where they're described in court records, thunderstones are often in there. That's the term for an archaeological object that was used in Europe, expressing a different folk belief. Now, for those who come to Catholic countries, and here I'm speaking, of course, of Saint-Domingue, it's a different story. First of all, there's no barrier to them being baptized. In fact, what we know from the church, the records of the priests who worked there, I'm using to begin Pierre-Charles Charlevoix, who writes a history of the Jesuit mission in Saint-Domingue. And essentially what they say, first of all, they baptize everybody immediately. Everybody's baptized, and therefore everybody's eligible to go to church. However, it's a problem for them because the Jesuit priests are very much restricted in how much access they can have to actually educating people. Instead, the security regulations that are in effect in Saint-Domingue are so stringent that they're not allowed to, basically Africans weren't allowed to go to church, or it was very difficult for them to go to church. And very often the priests were not allowed to go with them. And so we have actually complaints, arrêts in the archives that say that they also are not allowed to catechize each other, which I thought is an interesting statement, and it brings me to an important point. And that is that we know, for example, from a remarkable work by the Moravian missionary Christoph Georg Andreas Oldendorp, who he came to the Virgin Islands in the middle of the 18th century with the task of figuring out how to evangelize the slaves. And one of the things he wanted to do was figure out what language to use. So he interviews hundreds of slaves. And in the process, he gives us little mini biographies of some of them. And he asks them all kinds of questions about their homelands. What was their religion in their homelands? What was it like? What was their name for God? How did they bury the dead? And then what they were doing in the West Indies. So it's a remarkable text in this regard, only published in 2000. And what Oldendorp has is he says that among the Congolese who are in his island, there are a number of people who in fact engage in baptizing newly arrived slaves. He says he believes they were priests in Congo, and that they were Catholics, and that they had a sort of a ceremony when new slaves arrived. They would go down to meet them in the boat. They would give them a little slap on the face for the sins they had committed in Guinea, and baptize them with water and salt. In Kikongo, the word for baptism is kudiamungwa, which means to eat salt. And so the salt in the mouth and the slap on the face, that's all part of the process. And then they would baptize them in that way. And he says it was not just one or two people, but he knew there were a number of people who were doing this kind of thing. So there is a sort of a tradition of proselytization by Congolese of other people around them. There's also an Inquisition case in Brazil, about the same time as Oldendorp, of a man named Pedro Congo. We can figure out where he came from, who was caught conducting mass for a large number of slaves from Mina, which is the Yoruba-speaking area. And he was apparently dressed in a proper priest's outfit, and he was intoning apparently in Latin. He got in trouble with the Inquisition for that, although it's not clear that he was punished very strongly for it. But again, it's another example of how we might imagine that the Congos are basically explaining Christianity to other people. And for those people, it's important to recognize they're looking to contact higher deities. It's not like they don't want to. And these are people who can tell them how to do that and what to expect and what to look for. And so they introduce basically the saints to those folks. Okay. So it's probably no mistake that much of the vocabulary of the amulet making that we meet, for example, there was a celebrated case in Saint-Domingue in 1758 of a man named Macandal, who was accused of a huge poisoning scheme. And he was tried, and there was a little bit of evidence about what he did and what he said. It was pretty clear that he may have been doing some poisoning, but he was also doing a lot of healing and the kind of thing that we would expect somebody who could capture these spirits was doing. And the vocabulary of Macandal's stuff was mostly in Kikongo. And I think that's probably true, because I think that what you had was there were people who had the capacity to do this who weren't Congos, of course, but the Congos were the ones that helped them to wed that to Christianity. And so they were the ones that are likely to provide vocabulary. It's not a slam dunk. It's not everybody. It's not all the vocabulary, but it may explain the predominance of that particular tradition there. And I owe that to Christine Mobley in particular. Okay, so now what I want to do is talk a little bit about the junction of the Catholic saint and the one other African deity, or the one African deity that can cross the ocean, and that's the Yoruba and the Fon deities. So we know that one of the characteristics of all of these religions is the juncture, the syncretization of a Catholic saint and a Yoruba or a Fon god. It's rare that we find anybody that's not from that group, and it's not surprising given that what we've learned. Interestingly enough, though, it's really hard to find the exact evidence of that co-revelation. A co-revelation is where a tradition, one religious tradition, has something that happens that's recognizable in another religious tradition. So it's a revelation to both practitioners. I call that a co-revelation, and it's usually vouchsafed by a miracle. The earliest example I can find of that, in which the emerging voodoo practice, which is first described for us actually by Melville J in great detail, though, in 1797, he doesn't mention in his text anything about the merger of a Catholic deity or Catholic saint and an African deity. That's not something that he mentions. He does certainly talk a lot about saints, and he talks a lot about the snake god and other gods that are present in this group. He doesn't name enough of them for us to know, but we have very strong suspicion of what it was about. There is, however, a co-revelation that's described by Thomas Madieu in his History of Haiti, which is a famous one, which was an apparition of the Virgin Mary who occurred in a silk cotton tree. Now, we know from the Yoruba, from the Fon traditions that are described in the 17th and 18th centuries, that there was a category of deities that were responsible, lived in these trees. And so this is a co-revelation. It does suggest that this particular saint, if we consider the Virgin to be a saint, is also being revealed in the trees. And therefore, possibly this process is just taking place. It isn't really until late in the 19th century that we get more explicit evidence of this. This is Spencer St. John. Spencer St. John was the English consul to now independent Haiti in 1864. He's probably most famous for writing a lurid description of a trial that took place in 1864, I think about that same time, in which a group of people were accused of murdering small children in a ritual manner and then eating them. And he wrote, I don't know, maybe 40 pages, a good chunk of his book on Haiti was just about that one trial. And he got a famous rebuke from every Haitian scholar, every Haitian intellectual who could possibly do so, was lining up to tag Spencer St. John. But if you put aside that for a minute, he also mentions that in 1873, he traveled around and actually visited a number of voodoo temples. And in that, he said, without exception, they all had images of the saints in them. And so I'm inclined to believe that this altar here, which has images of the saints very prominent in it, as well as objects that would be associated with what I'm calling spiritual receptacles, that would have been useful for this, they do show this possibility taking place. The first time we actually have a description of voodoo after Moreau de Saint-Méry is by a Haitian intellectual named Duverneau-Trouillot, who published a short esquisse historique, ethnographique, in 1885. And in this, which is an apology and a response also to Spencer St. John, in which he gives the name of the Fon deities. That's the first time we get a detailed set of names of these deities, and also notes their connections to Catholic saints. A few years after him, a French spiritualist by the name of Nathan Zeffar visited in 1897, visited Saint-Domingue, and he published a series of articles about the religious life there. He was a spiritualist, so he was interested in this in a way that didn't make the sort of judgments that the Catholic Church made. He describes a fuller hierarchy with many of these connections in his series of articles that appeared in the spiritualist journal, L'Illustration. And so finally, we get to the period where I guess we might say we put Spencer St. John to rest, and we have people like Jean Primaire here, or Melville Herskovits, and finally Soren Neil Hurston, who within a very few years of each other bring us the first really detailed, sympathetic accounts of Haitian religion. And so on this note, I'm going to terminate my part of the discussion, and I'll take questions.
John, that was fabulous.
Thank you.
Amazing. Is Barbaro coming on? And Alejandro? Great, Alejandro, thank you for that marvelous introduction. Is Barbara there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Beautiful. Alejandro, John, as Alejandro said, I talk to you and Linda, sometimes when I'm doing a project every day, even if I'm in Africa. So I wanted to defer. I'll ask my questions later if we run out. I have a feeling that we won't, but there is one sort of a question that's come up as I've lectured. I started to say around the country, but I haven't left my kitchen table. But I've given a zillion lectures about the Black church, and as you know, we were blessed, as Black people would say, the response to the Black church. And even in the reviews, people point to the fact, as one of the surprises of the series, drawing on your work, among others, is that the percentage of the enslaved Africans who were Muslim, practicing Muslim, and Congolese Catholics who came to North America through the United States. And that, I mean, it's generated an enormous amount of discussion and almost awe. And you would think that people would know about the Muslims because at least since Alan Austin, when I was a baby professor at Yale, John Blaskame and I were editing a series and we published his collection of Muslim slave narratives. So you would think that that would be in circulation, but not so much knowledge of Congolese Catholicism. And now that we have the transatlantic slave trade database, we know how many enslaved Africans, more or less, came from Congo, Angola, how many came from Senegambia, et cetera, et cetera. We could begin to triangulate. How about Cuba? I'm curious, a student of Cuba, and obviously my wife's a great scholar of Cuban history and the slave trade. And we talk a lot about this issue. Where the Muslims, how come the Muslims came to the United States and left a written record in Arabic, and they didn't do so, as far as I know, in Cuba? And what about the relationship between the Congolese Catholics and the population that show up on the island of Cuba? Though I know it's most of the enslaved people came to Cuba after Haiti was born and after the slave trade was abolished in 1808. But I'm just curious about the differences between Cuba and the United States, or Haiti, Cuba, and the United States, however you want to put it.
Yeah, well, so I have to refer here to Manuel Barcia, who's actually wrote a specific article on the question of Muslims in Haiti. In Cuba. And he observes that there was a slave trade that was literally bi-directional to Brazil and also to Cuba at the very same time. And they all came from very much the same place. In Brazil, we have a whole Muslim slave uprising. There's all kinds of archival material on people making amulets and things like that. And there's nothing like that in Cuba. And it is really quite remarkable. I don't know how to explain it because there's no question that they were there. And there's the hints and so on. I mean, you have to remember that, first of all, the Spanish kept amazing archives. And the section that was called the Consul Militar or something, this section was like, it's like, I don't know, 100,000 pages worth of records. They were spying on everybody and reporting everything. You could go crazy in that archive and you don't find Muslims there. And Manuel had the same problem. He doesn't really know how to explain it because it's very much the same kind of environment. You have the same sort of proportions of people. You have lots of Muslims in the group. In Brazil, they show up all over the place. They're probably the biggest physical, explicit Muslim presence in the Americas is in Bahia. And why isn't it in Cuba? So I'm going to just say it's a mystery. I don't know how to say that. Maybe they didn't get in trouble with the law.
Great. Alejandro and Barbara, would you like to ask the first couple of questions, please?
This question of the Muslims is such an interesting question because, of course, researching absences is always very difficult, right? And even in Brazil, we've learned about this only relatively recently that we know more about the Muslim presence in Brazil and, Joao Rey's work and all that. And I suspect, John, I could be wrong about this, that when we look for it and when historians begin to look for it, they'll probably find some of the evidence, that the evidence is there to be found and that we just haven't asked the questions. Because, and this goes back to what I was saying in the introduction, it's only recently that we have really begun to produce the kind of scholarship that would lead to that sort of research. So that would be my guess, and it's just a guess, that if we really hit especially the regional archives of, you mentioned the Comisión Militar, there's gotta be cases there with enslaved Muslims, One thing that I thought was fascinating about your talk is these references to sort of Congos explaining Christianity, and this case that you mentioned of Pedro Congo in Brazil, and it made me think of a recent book. I don't know if you've read it, by Larissa Brewer Garcia, Beyond Babel. It's a very recent book. It came out last fall, and what she does is to study how African translators played a key role for Jesuit priests in places like Cartagena de India and Lima and stuff. And by being translators, these mostly enslaved Africans, some of whom did not speak Spanish, but could communicate in various African languages, sort of became from translators, they became places of enunciation of Catholic doctrine. I mean, they had a privileged space to serve this intermediary role. And the Jesuits could do nothing about it because they had to basically, people like Sandoval had to look, and they see these Africans occupy the high chair and talk to people, and they didn't know what the hell they were talking about. And that changes a little bit, how we think about this. And as I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about this recent work that is trying to get at some of these questions from this end, from this side of the Atlantic. And thought I would mention it to you just to hear your thoughts about how we could perhaps productively connect, that kind of more local research on this and with the kind of work that, person who is primarily an Africanist like you, what kind of opportunities do you see there? Because in Larissa's work, there is really not much about Africa. It's more about the Africans here playing that role,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, one of the more interesting sort of anecdotes about that particular episode is in 1654 or so, the king of Alada decided to send an embassy to Spain with the idea of having priests come and see what they could do. And the ship that took the Dahomean ambassador, the Aladian ambassador to Spain, like all ships that go from Africa to the Americas to Europe had to pass through the Americas, and they stopped at Cartagena. And then as soon as they arrived back in Spain, there's a catechism in the phone language for using an Alada. And I'm pretty sure that catechism was actually created by one of those interpreters that you're talking about, one of Pedro Claver's interpreters, probably. In fact, because so many of those interpreters testified at the Inquisition for his or investigation of his sainthood, you could probably even figure out what his name was. What's interesting about it, of course, is that when they decided to translate, the word they used for God was voodoo, and the word they used for Jesus was Lisa. So Lisa is, if we look at Oldendorp, who's a century after this, but Oldendorp does mention Lisa as among the deities found in that greater region, who he actually identifies him as a white Negro. So presumably Jesus was white and male, and voodoo was black and female, or something like that. And I think that kind of thing, man, this is a unique piece of evidence. I don't know how much farther we can go with that, but I'm pretty sure that that's what's going on. I mean, everybody's translating, all these interpreters are translating to other people in their own language, and they're having to find the spiritual vocabulary that they work with. And apparently they're not necessarily restricted from using local terms. I mean, you might just say you have to call God Dios and Jesus Jesus, because we want to distinguish that from any deity that you might have, but obviously that doesn't happen. And I'm imagining that the ones who are working with Mandingas and Congas and all these other groups of people are not necessarily deciding to go with the Spanish or Latin term. But again, that's a speculation, except that we do have this one catechism. And even then I can't prove that it was an interpreter who did this, but I just have a feeling it was.
Great. Barbaro? Oh, by the way, Alejandro, what is the name of that? Not After Babel, that's George Steiner's book. What is it?
Beyond Babel.
Oh, okay.
Beyond Babel, okay.
Got it. Barbaro?
Yeah, thank you, Thornton. I think finally we just see face to face digitally. I think in the beginning of your presentation, you kind of paint a very loose structure and ephemeral organizations of the Congo, the way Congo, the traditional historical Congo religion, and you claims using historical sources to to arrive to the kind of conclusion in opposition. It's the way it sounds to me. In opposition is a well-oiled and organized understanding of Catholicism. That kind of contradictions that was kind of part of your beginning of your presentation. And going back to record from Kawasi, there are specific reference about the organization of the Congo religion, the historical religion. I reference to Simbi, not just Zambia and Pungo Tulendo. There's a specific structure, specific names about practices. You can find in someone like Laman, who spent 35 years of his life and write the most comprehensive set of research on the Congo from an outsider. We have a German doctor, Fortune Loss, going to the 19th century, also writing about traditional medicines in that particular. We have the record from George Grenfell, who was the founder of a Baptist church in the Mbanza Congo, who in 1930 organized the burnings of 1,000 traditional objects, and he did 5 years later. I mean, we have in 1930 is such a vital practice of a Congo religion, what the people in the Mbanza Congo call Makisinsi, and then someone like Jansen's already studied those kind of tradition, those kind of formations. But my question is how you can narrate a different kind of story of a formation of religion, historical religion, outside those traditional historical sources, European sources. It is possible to do that. It's possible to interview people that are practitioners. The way you describe the religion, I born in and practice a religion since I was over 50. I spent all my life in that religion, and the way you explain it to me, it sounds so strange. I couldn't understand the way you describe the basic principle of the Congo religions, and that for me is I struggling to understand the way you frame the basic principle of the religion, and even there is a way in which we can do a comparison between practitioners of the Congo religion in the diaspora in places like Cuba, Haiti, or Brazil, with the way the understanding of the same tradition or similar tradition back in Angola or in the Congo. Without this kind of conversation, I think would be almost impossible for me to picture, to have a better picture of what the religion looked like, only with realizing those sources that are back in centuries before. I don't know, it's a question, but it's a comment.
Well, let me just say that one of the strategies I've always used as a historian is to try to work with the expectation that civilizations, cultures, and religions change over time. And if that's to be demonstrated, then the only way we can do that is talk to people who lived in those times. And of course, we can't interview them today, so we have to take whatever they send us. And then hopefully we'll come to some truth for that. So the approach I took in the article that I wrote for Linda Heywood's book was a threefold approach, which is that I read a number of the self-ethnography kinds of things, like the Le Mans Cahiers. I'm sure you know these. These publications, and also works by people who are associated with I guess you might say modern Congo religions. I've looked at that work as well, but I've also tried to take a look at what we get from the old sources. And granted, these people are foreigners. Many of them are not necessarily terribly well versed in the languages, although some of them are. They're also, of course, dealing in a country, if they're in the Kingdom of Congo, in which a significant number of the nobility speak Portuguese and read and write Portuguese. So we don't know necessarily exactly how they interact with who they interact with and where they get their understandings from. It's the historian's dilemma. We can't interview people in the 17th century today, barring seance or something like that. So that's just the methodology I had to use. And I mean, it's difficult to imagine the Kingdom of Congo not evolving given the manifold numbers of people who witnessed what was going on, at least the practice of Christianity in that country. I want to make it clear too that this was a locally organized church. It was not really the work of the missionaries. The missionaries there were primarily to perform the sacraments. They certainly did educational tasks, and they wrote no small number of denunciations. The denunciations tell us a little bit about what the local religion was like. But we know that the church itself, that is to say the Congo church, tolerated and acknowledged all of the sort of things that the missionaries didn't approve of. Which is why they survived. I imagine if Alfonso had actually had his goal and he'd been able to ordain all his own people as priests and so on, maybe it would have developed in a different way. Maybe it would have been more like the sort of orthodoxy. But you have to remember the church in Congo was born in the medieval times. It was born before the Reformation. And when the witnesses who tell us the most arrive, they're part of that Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. They're going to war with exactly those kinds of practices in Europe that we're meeting in Central Africa. And so, we're stuck with sort of having to deal with that. We don't have a lot of a contrary different type of evidence. So sure, you can go to, I'm proposing that, let's say that the traditional religion in Congo has changed through the impact of, the only part of this region I know is Angola. It's changed through the impact of Christian missionization in the colonial period. One of the things I was struck with whenever I go to Mbanza, Congo, is that people are convinced that the Kingdom of Congo was simply a colony and that the Portuguese had imposed this religion the way they were imposing it in the colonial period when they really did control that region, and that there's a reaction to that. So, and I'm not saying I don't know how much comes through all of that to the present day, but speaking as a historian, I work with historical texts I can deal with.
No, I understand. I understand the argument about religion change. But religion changed. In Mbanza, Congo, in 1999, it used to have only 8,000 people. Now you will have the city have over 150,000 people. You can imagine how the changes that take place in a population and that growth in 10, 15 years or 20 years. But what we know is still, even from Grenfell, the need to destroy that traditional religion by burning objects, and something we have a systematic burning for 500 years. Despite that, what the Angolan called Maquizinci, that is almost like an underground, almost illegal by the government. Still, there are more than 50 Nganga Mauku in Mbanza, Congo. And now you can have access to them because the government forced them to register and pay fees to have a license to practice today. But even we can go back before that the government made those decisions to supervise and police traditional religion because they are suspicious for the governments that have these. They are suspicious about traditional religion because I think traditional religion they are associated with revolts and splitting the country and unifying the Bakongo with the Congo from the DRC. But what I try to, if we realize in all these resources we have, there are more than 90 sites with rock paintings around in Congo. There is 2 different graphic writing systems. The Bakongo have their own writing system. They have their own books called Makaba in the Bundu dia Congo, in which they write their own history. And it seems to me not to look those kind of evidence way to understand history is quite dangerous. Well, you have a Lumbu, they have those tradition of songs that go back almost 400 years. They use song to remember history in the Lumbu until today. And if not paying attention to those kind of information, for me, is quite dangerous. But if we don't have this conversation between the traditional religion in Mbanza Congo or in Kinshasa or in Mbanza Ngungu, but what happened in the diaspora, in the other side, I can tell you for someone who practiced that religion, the principle, of course the religion changed, but the principle is still connected, still related. The upside, the superficial corresponds, they do not match, but the principle of the religion, they are similar, and only until you get into those spaces, you will be able to understand. You can ask a voice like someone from Fukiao Bunseki, when you have someone like Jansen in 1967 explaining the importance to understand someone from that particular tradition who has the right to tell the whole history. And we made the decision not to include his own voice could be quite dangerous to me. But even that, Bakongo people, the practitioner of Congo religion in Cuba, they self-published book since the beginning of the 20th century. And you can find in every single botanica in Boston, in Los Angeles, in New York, in Miami. But you have a scholar who already collect those notebooks that they use, a practitioner used to record their own religious development throughout her life, like someone like Lydia Cabrera or Fernando Ortiz. But even that, the Bakongo people today, or practitioners of the Congo religion, are still publishing their own books. You can get online, and they still, the story, they have to do nothing with the Catholic Church whatsoever. That, it just, maybe the question is about what is history? What constitutes a history? And the choices we made as a scholar to silence certain voices could be quite dangerous.
John, you want to respond?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I know how to respond exactly. I do know that people visited the Kingdom of Congo, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and what they reported was a great devotion to the Catholic Church. It doesn't mean at all that they abandoned everything from the other tradition. Indeed, that's exactly what we're talking about, is the survival of that other tradition integrated into the way that the Congolese in particular practice Christianity. And now the missionaries tell us that very explicitly. Yes, they burned the objects. There's no question about it. But that doesn't mean that the church itself didn't support those objects. These people had their role. Typically, the way in which they did so is they would say these are being used for witchcraft. And certainly, this is always a capacity within the Congo tradition that a person can use spiritual forces to harm others. And that's Ndoki, that's witchcraft. And so there's certainly possible that that's going on. And that's generally speaking the language they speak. They understood that religious tradition as consistently and continuously being witchcraft. This is what a missionary priest did. That's why they use words like superstition and fetichero and so on, because those are terms that relate to witchcraft. Congolese would also agree that it's possible that such a thing could be used for witchcraft. And they might support burning it for that reason. The question is only the degree. And generally speaking, they tolerated the missionaries because they wanted them to perform the sacraments. And so they put up with them, and these guys didn't come around very often. They came around once a year. If they were lucky, they'd have a missionary come, or a priest would come and baptize the children. Many times they waited many years. Many times they never got baptized at all because they never had a priest that they saw that could do it. But I mean, the fact is that this is just the way I understand what was going on back then. And I don't see that what you're talking about today is necessarily different. If you go to Banzo Congo today or anywhere, you certainly people or practicing Christians, they may do many other things as well. They may annex that to there. But I mean, certainly you can find people who are also rejecting all of that in Angola and everywhere else. Because that's how religions change, and that's how they evolve. And so,
and we're talking about an evolutionary period of 530 years. I mean, over the King of Congo converted to Catholicism in 530 years ago, right? So it's over half a millennium of evolution between that conversion and Barbara. You said when you were 15, right? You were started practicing religion. Is that what I heard you say?
3.
When you were 3, I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, I was 3, and I'm over 50, and that's what I tried to say. I am over 50.
That you're what, over 50 now?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, I thought that, but I didn't need the translation on that part.
Yeah.
But the two things are not mutually exclusive, and you know, Barbara, better as well as I do. It's difficult to date an oral tradition precisely, but you know, we know that oral traditions are old, but how a thing evolved between 530 years ago and your 3rd birthday, that's, you know, there is a lot of time for change there. By the way, Bob Thompson used to bring, he would say Foucault, but you say Foucault?
Foucault.
Yeah, I met him, had dinner with him several times because Thompson would bring him to Yale at the beginning of my career. So we had, I had the benefit of hearing him talk and, you know, being translated more or less by Thompson. So that's quite fascinating. Abby, should we open it up?
Yes, there are a lot of questions, so I'm not going to do my usual grouping and moving around. And I do want to say that it has just started storming where I am, and there's a lot of thunder and lightning. So if I lose power, Matt Weinberg will take over for me, and it'll be seamless. So,
well, it rained like hell in Cambridge about an hour ago.
Okay, well, it's moved out here now.
Good. So, I hope it moves to your and Alejandro's house and gets away from Marielle and my house.
Well, it's at my house at least. Can't speak for Alejandro's, but so John, thank you so much for this, and thank you Alejandro and Barbara also for your insights and questions as well, and Skip too, of course. There are a lot, I want to say there was a lot of just appreciation being expressed by the audience for the education we're all receiving, including from a journalist named Jim Dingman, who covered modern Angola for many years. And he says that this conversation is very helpful to him. I also wanted to note that Marielle Iglesias, whom Skip mentioned, did send a note kind of echoing, I think, a lot of what Barbara has just been saying. I don't know if you want to respond further to it or not. She says, you're using written sources, mostly from European missionaries and scholars, as evidence. Are those kinds of colonial sources reliable when it comes to the indigenous religious beliefs? I don't know if you have anything to add to that at this point.
Yeah.
John, you have to answer that. That's my wife.
That's why I put the question.
Well, I mean, it is a fact that the Congolese elite has been literate since the 15th century. And that was what as Mestre de Escola was all about. Unfortunately, most of what they wrote hasn't survived for us. Archives have been destroyed. I personally believe there are archives in Angola today which go back at least to the 18th century. But right now we can't put our hands on them. And that's how it works. But I mean, we can say from the documentation on the African side that we have, it is, needless to say, pretty much Christian oriented, even when it deals with internal affairs. So for example, in 1550, King Diogo had an inquest into a treason a treasonous plot against him, and he organized an inquest, and he had sworn testimony by people from the Congo. So everybody who was testifying was Congo. And to the degree they talked about religious affairs, which they didn't do much, they did, however, at least bring an African voice to the game. One of the things that they noted, of course, was that Diogo's rival, Pedro, had taken refuge in a church, and that this was considered sufficiently important that the king, even though it was his mortal enemy, would not break ecclesiastical sanctuary for that rebel against him. There's also references to people swearing oaths. Again, these are Christian oaths. And this is not in a colonial context. This inquest was conducted in the Kingdom of Congo about a Congolese affair with Congolese witnesses. And I mean, many of them are from the elite. And we get, of course, the many different letters that come from Congolese people as well. Antonio Manuel, Alvaro's ambassador to Rome, left 70 documents of his own. Many of those are religious documents. Although again, they're all into what we would consider the Christian, or at least the mystical tradition. He has some things that we would describe as mystical, maybe with a Carmelite twist to them. He had served himself as a schoolmaster. Antonio Manuel had. He had certificates from the King of Congo and from officials in the Congolese government, giving him appointments and letters and so on. So I mean, I don't think we should be taken over by the idea that our written records are just from European sources. And then secondly, even if they are, I mean, historians are forever reading sources that are hostile to the subject being discussed. And when we try to judge the veracity of what they say and also how much they know about what they're talking about, we do have to recognize they have experiences in those regions. This is the historian's task, is to take a look at people who are long dead and are the only people who can talk to us from those times. And we don't get to ask them questions and get answers or cross-examine them. We just have to have what they give us. I'm personally quite suspicious of imagining that a religious tradition that's continuously revealed will remain absolutely static over periods of time. It's going to pass from generation to generation and from revelation to revelation. Revelation takes different forms at different times. It doesn't necessarily have to be fixed in all time. It's not a dogmatic tradition. That's, I think, the main point. So it would be surprising if we should find some sort of a dogmatic continuity through several hundred years.
Great. Actually, on that subject, or reminds me of this question, the scholar Cheryl Townsend Gilks has thanks you for teaching her new terms as tools for her own work, especially co-revelation. And her question is, do you know, or is there any indication that people who were deported to the New World in the Middle Passage could have been practitioners who were disruptive of the Catholicism in Congo and were specifically targeted for deportation for that reason?
You can be sure that people were deported if they were disruptive of anything in the political order. That's the nature of what goes on in a place like that. And yes, we know that, in fact, people who were, for example, when there were Catholic priests that were in authority to do so, they would arrest people, and the Congolese state would agree to that arrest, and they would deport them. And so, yeah, those people went to America. It's not exactly from Congo, but Kavadzi tells an interesting story in which he knew two famous Nganga, this was in the Kimbundu-speaking area, who had made a lot of trouble, and they deported them to Brazil. When they got to Brazil, the governor recognized them and sent them back. And so they ended up coming back to Angola. So yes, in fact, the people who are the ones who do the discovery in the New World are precisely these kinds of people, whether they were deliberately deported or whether they were simply caught up in the massive deportations. There's a priest in Martinique who actually did a census of his community. He said there were 2,400 people in his community, and 26 of them were sorcerers. So I'm assuming that those people he's defining as sorcerers are actually people who have the kind of technique and skill to be able to discover whatever spiritual entities are out in their environment there in America, and to be able to operate with them, to be able to make charms or amulets or other kinds of ways that they can use to protect people in their environment. I mean, we have lots and lots of sort of casual references to sorcerers in other sources, not quantitative like that one, but certainly this was something that was recognized, that those type of people with those skills would be the ones that would be targeted in this particular environment. If they were deported for religious crimes in Africa, it's likely because they were accused of witchcraft.
Thank you. I may mispronounce something in this question, so forgive me if I do. There's some cross-pollination in the language group of Euphone Yoruba. Is you, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Anyway.
Okay, Ewe. Okay, is Ewe linguistic spiritual group incorporated in the Fon Yoruba religious influence across the Atlantic?
So there's an interesting study by Bonaventure Yai, he's no longer with us, Olabia Yai, of what he calls the language of Mina. So in Brazil, Mina was a generic term for people who came from the Costa de Mina, which is the coast that has Dahomey, Alada, Huida, and so on. And also Minas might be described as people from the Yoruba region, although they might be named other ways as well. And in this language, Yai is able to detect multiple dialects within the words that are in the text. And this isn't surprising, I think, because basically what you're having is you have people who speak related languages, maybe different dialects of different languages, and between them they create a lingua franca that they can all understand. This is a wonderful text because it demonstrates how that process takes place. They're still working within mutually intelligible languages or slightly mutually intelligible languages. I mean, I can say that, for example, for me, if I hear people speaking Kimbundu, I can understand maybe 3/4 of what they say because it has a lot of commonality with Kikongo. On the other hand, people from the other side of the Congo River speaking what they say is Kikongo, I have a harder time understanding. But I think that those are relatively minor issues. People resolve them. A lot of times just getting used to phonological differences between one language and another. And maybe, there's idiomatic and grammatical mistakes that you would make as you do that, but people can get through that. I remember once I gave a talk in Brazil and apologized at the end of my talk for my terrible Portuguese. And one of the members of the audience said that if you have vocabulary and enthusiasm, you don't need grammar. And I've always liked that particular expression because a lot of times you can figure out the vocabulary. The grammar, you can figure that out without much, we don't need nearly the grammar that we get to use. So I think this is what happens in the other world. You do get a lot of people who are trying to communicate with each other. And maybe they end up all learning a same language, likely the colonial language or a pidgin. They have a pidgin language that they speak. But even, if they're in the same language family, I mean, it's like, for example, you had, say, Spanish and Portuguese people together, they probably figure out how to speak Portuñol.
Yeah, I think what you just said hurts my grammarian's heart, but I agree with I know that what you're saying is true. So Miller Boyd has a couple of questions. I think they're short, so I'll ask them both. He thanks you for this wonderful talk and says, is there a direct or indirect connection between the snake deities of Ouida and the Haitian Lua, Dambala? And also, isn't the Arabic name for Jesus Isa?
Okay, well, I'll shout out to Miller Boyd, who was a student at BU some years ago. We keep in touch every so often. And I'm glad for his question. And certainly Dambala is related to the same snake deity in Ouida, exactly. That is reported as his name by Oldendorp, who's actually the first source to mention the name of that deity that we have. And he also has variants on it. So there's Daboy and there's several other variants on it. I imagine these are dialect variations wherever he goes. And as for Arabic and Jesus and Isa, that's a very good point. The fact that Muslims recognize the prophecy, well, they would say the prophecy of Jesus is a part of their normal religious life makes it very easy for Muslims to be able to deal with Christianity. I think that, following the Muslims will be an interesting task for us. And as I hope that Alejandro is right and that we'll find more evidence of Muslims in Cuba. One thing I do know from the research I've done is that both the Spanish and the Portuguese make detailed records of everything they do. However, the Portuguese lose their records and the Spanish keep theirs. So if you want to know something about anything, go to a country that has Spanish as their language. If you're in a Portuguese speaking area, you might find something great, but it won't be consistent. But if you go to the Spanish areas, it will be consistent. I just remember working in the archives in Cuba and having a document of about 300 or 400 folios. And Alejandro knows how the archives are there. And all the pages were kind of stuck together. And so I had to sort of lift it up just so to peek inside, and desperately afraid that I would, break it. But yet there it was, and this is a marvelous document because it was the record of a Kabildo that was the Congo Kabildo, and they had actually had sub units in this Kabildo, and they correspond to the 3 sub-dialects of Kikongo. That is to say, the dialect that's spoken in the old Kingdom of Congo. There was a Solongo Kabildo, and there was I think they called it a Congo one, and then they called one they called Zombo. And you still hear those names today. People will tell you the difference between the Zombo dialect and the Sansala dialect and the Solongo dialect, which aren't terribly great, but it's distinctive. You know one when you hear it.
Moving to music, there are a couple of questions about music. Alan Ornelas asks, are there any sources that reference music from Congo before and after Catholic influence? And Andrea Guerrero Mosquera, who sends greetings from Mexico, is asking if you can tell us a bit about the relationship between musical instruments and religion.
Yeah, well, shout out to Andrea. I was on her committee at the University of Mexico. I'm glad to hear from her and that she's on board. So musical instruments, and well, this is a fascinating topic in its own right. So one of the things that came to Congo along with Christianity was also Christian music. However, when you take a look at pictures, for example, of a priest saying mass, and I think there's in fact in the publicity for this particular event, there's a picture of a priest saying mass. And if you look at the parishioners back there, they're playing a marimba, a drum, and a horn. And it's really going to be difficult not to Africanize that music with that combination of instruments present, the drums, the marimba, and so on. The Jesuits claimed that when they were preaching in San Salvador and Banza Congo, that they taught songs that caused lions and tigers or lions to keep away from the country. And when they stopped singing, the lions came back and ate people. I don't know if that's really true, but we do hear accounts, for example, of people singing, polyphonically, which would be a European import. I have a fascinating reference, which I would really like to know with regards to the musical traditions in the area. And that is that a French missionary working in what would be the Solongo speaking area in the 1870s says that they had a particular type of Christian music, which didn't sound like anything he'd ever heard in Africa or in Europe. And I'm wondering if that wasn't Congo musicians taking, let's say, a Catholic hymn and repackaging it with their instruments and with their musical sensibilities, and then playing it that way. And one of the things I'm wondering about is just exactly what kind of impact that type of repackaging of Christian music in Africa and then translating to the Americas might have had on the development of African-American music, or particularly spirituals. But of course, unless we had sheet music or some kind of recording device, or somebody recorded in recent times songs that seem like they came from that period, or that the priest himself might have made musical notations. But as far as I know, none of that happened. So it'll maybe remain a mystery until we find out more about it. But certainly the thing about music is that while individual people might be very channeled with regards to what they want in music, musicians themselves are often incredibly open about what influences they'll take. And they're musicians, they have to please an audience. And so they're listening to what people like. And if they can bring something that they'd heard from somewhere down the road and bring it into their music and repurpose it, they might win their audience over. I think this is the reason why African-American music, I speak it broadly here to refer to all of the Americas, is so popular worldwide, is because those musicians had to repackage multiple musical traditions, both from Africa and from the Americas, into something that everybody liked. And they succeeded sufficiently well that they made a world-conquering musical tradition. Whether it's from Cuba, whether it's from Brazil, from Jamaica, or from the United States, African-based creolized music is a world music par excellence.
I think it occurred to me hearing Cheryl Jiltz's comment, and Cheryl's a great friend and a great scholar of religion and a consultant for the history of the Black Church. But she made me think, Barbaro, going back to our question about static and dynamic over half a millennium and how quickly things can change. Sorry, Abby has sent the thunderstorm that was at her house over my head.
Sorry.
So it's like thunder, lightning, and everything else. But just to give you a couple examples in the Black tradition, we know the first Africans came to Florida in 1526, and then the first Africans came to British North America in 1619. Over about 100 years, the Anglicans wouldn't even convert the Africans. They had huge debates, and it culminates with Morgan Godwin writing a book in 1680 saying, these people really are human beings because they can read and write and laugh. They had risibility, engage in the trades, and we can convert them, but that doesn't mean that we will free them. Then in 1750, it's the height of the Great Awakening. And 59% of the Africans, Barbaro, came to the United States after 1750, which is one of the great things about the transatlantic slave trade. And then you realize, oh my God, the Methodists and the Baptists are welcoming these new arrivants with open arms into the Christian faith, whereas the Anglicans weren't doing it a century before. And the first and the oldest African-American denomination is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is really the Methodist Episcopal Church made Black. Then it would change. And then another seismic shift occurs in 1895 with the founding of the National Baptist Convention. And how quickly did that change occur? Within 10 years, 61.4% of all African Americans were Baptist, with more than 2.2 million members in a 10-year period. And then in 1895 to 1897, the Church of God in Christ is born. Now the Church of God in Christ has 100 million members around the world. All I'm saying is that these paradigm shifts can occur very, very quickly, and it's difficult to historicize, or important that we historicize and try to allow for how slowly or quickly change could occur. It's a long way, in other words, between 1619 and 1895, just in the African-American context, let alone in Congo and Angola.
No, and I understand that. I think is that my observation was how we make a decision, what kind of source is more stable than other. And I think that for me is problematic. But even when you have the Baptist Church that collects a lot of material, and the 3 generations of the Grenfell, the last one who served in Angola until I think 1989 or 1992, the 3 his father and his grandfather who used to write for the newsletter for the Baptist Church, producing in Congo and circulating in London to all of the churches in the world in this very violent language, talking about evil, devil practice and so forth. At the same time, they are writing books about the local religions, and they never shared those kind of information with the church. And they are unpublished now in Regent Park College at Oxford. 3 generations, or over 80 years, a 3 generation of priests from the Baptist Church. They have an incredible interest in the religion. They write books, manuscripts. They don't share with anyone, but at the same time, they write in this horrible language about authorizing burning 1,000 objects.
Oh, of course.
Why
Yeah.
in 5 years is just tell you.
Oh yeah, but they're writing in the colonial period, right?
Yeah.
Which is after 1880. Again, there's 1491, there's 1600, then there's a colonial period, and then there's 50 years ago when you're born, there's a lot of time for change there. And I think that the answer about the sources, Barbara, and surely you agree with this, is that we have to use both. We have to use the oral tradition. We have to use the printed sources, no matter who wrote them. We could put them under scrutiny, but we have to use whatever record was left in order to piece together the three dimensions of the story.
No, I'm not saying the opposite to that. I just make an observation.
Well, I think you should get those manuscripts, if you can, published, that are buried in the Oxford Library, right?
No, I have it. I have copies.
No, but you're going to publish them so we all can read them.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a book about Congo religions and
I know.
graphic writing system. It just
yeah, but I want to get you to get those original sources out. You and I happen to be in Angola talking about this matter.
Yeah.
On film. So I know your biography and bibliography. Abby, a couple more questions. John, how are you doing? It's 5:45.
Well, I'm okay. We got a thunderstorm here, but I can sustain it. I got a roof.
Right. We may all disappear. Who knows? So, well,
About
there are still. What's
two more questions? Is that good?
Sounds good. Yep. We were just talking about music, and we do have a few questions from a very prominent musician, Yosvani Terry. And one of his questions overlaps with the question of Tim Weiskell, who is also an affiliate of the Hutchins Center. So they are both asking you if you can say a few words about the research and contributions of Robert Farris Thompson in this regard.
With regards to music?
Hmm?
With regards to music, or with
No, not with regards to music. I was just making a little segue to Yosvani Terry. That's all. Question's not about music, just about their work, or about his work and what role it has played in your thinking about this, if any.
Well, no, I mean his work is foundational. I mean,
Yeah.
I started my work with Flash of the Spirit. So there, I mean, what can you say about somebody who's actually, really trying to look seriously at the African roots of African American culture and then of American culture as a whole, and is willing to go and do research in Nigeria and in DRC and so on to get the material to go with it. And like anybody who's a pioneer, maybe he has things in there that are, speculative, or maybe you wouldn't agree with them, but that's what we live for. If we decide that we're going to wait until we get the last word in before we publish anything, we'll be dead before we finish. And if we're so afraid of making a mistake or getting something wrong that we don't put what we know right now out there and let people toss it around a little bit, that's where we'll be. And Robert Farris Thompson published a lot of stuff, and he was a very accessible guy. I shouldn't use the past tense. He is a very accessible guy. And so, you guys were talking about what Africans might have done. All I'm thinking of is that, Robert Farris Thompson was where I started too. And you have to start somewhere, and that's where I started. So,
I'll tell you how important Robert Farris Thompson's work is. When I studied Yoruba religion, mythology with Wole Soyinka. And I asked him in my first year at Cambridge, and I asked him just on one-to-one in supervision for a year. And I asked him for Joswani, give me the best secondary source on Yoruba religion. And he gave me a book called Black Gods and Kings, written by Robert Farris Thompson. And this is like, it's amazing. Anthony Appiah tells the story of, we all know about rat trade. And that the court of the Asante would get in, and the nobles would get in arguments about tradition, and they would bring in Rattray's history of the Asante in order to adjudicate arguments among themselves. And I remember when Thompson turned from Yoruba to Congo, it was a big paradigm shift for him in terms of his thinking about influence in the New World. And when he did 4 moments of the sun. I drove all from New Haven to Washington just for the opening of that. And that catalog was amazing. And it made his work a lot more nuanced because we all took his course. In 1969, that was the first year a lot of Black kids came to Yale. And as Barbara mentioned in a seminar last month, you can date the institutional presence of African history in a history of art department to Bob Thompson at Yale. I mean, he was an undergraduate there and a graduate student, and then an assistant, associate, and then a full professor. So 2 years later, it's the first large class of Black kids come to Yale. And we all took Robert Ferris Thompson's class. And he taught it using 3 slide projectors. And this is fascinating. Like kids today can't imagine this, but one would show a motif from Africa. One would show the same visual motif in Afro-Latin America. And then the third would show the same motif in Afro-America, meaning the Black United States. And he called it the tricontinental approach. And, you know, he's been teaching that way since 1969. It was amazing. He was ahead of everybody. But when you have Wole Soyinka giving you Robert Thompson, this white guy, he's a white boy from West Tech, from El Paso, Texas. Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. His Yoruba too is, Soyinka said they would laugh every time he talked, but he had the sense, you know, he just didn't know how to speak it well with a Yoruba accent. But he's a genius and totally committed, as you could tell from his exuberance. Last question, Abby.
Okay. This is a question about a different topic. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. There are so many questions. This is from Toby Levin, who's also an affiliate of ours at the Hutchins Center. She's wondering where the women were. She found them in the snakes that you referenced, a traditional female symbol, and in the Virgin Mary and in Zora Neale Hurston, of course. But can you speculate on which specific rituals that survived the Middle Passage pertain to women, and especially fertility? And there are a number of questions about rituals that survive the Middle Passage. So this perhaps leads to, you know, can be a larger discussion too, but specifically, what are specific rituals that survive the Middle Passage pertaining to women?
Well, I mean, I would say that probably most everything that deals with fertility. First of all, I mean, we have to say that when we're talking about spiritual entities per se, those spiritual entities that are on this continent are local to this continent. We're not, except for those Yoruba gods, I'm contending anyway. I mean, we can argue about this, but this is what I'm throwing down, so to speak, is that most of those specific deities is left in Africa, and what we get over this side is what people discover here and what they make of it here. And so to the degree that, for example, people practicing Obia are female and engage in the things that are related to females, there's going to be a woman's presence in that tradition. And of course, there's also another thing, which is sort of a gender flexibility issue, which is that in many cases, you don't have, both in Africa and just in the confusion that results in the sex ratios, for example, that you have in the Americas, you're going to have issues with women's roles and women's places that aren't necessarily easily answered by traditional formula. And one of the ways of getting around that is by sort of transitioning through states. So obviously the most prominent woman that we think of in Congo religion is Dona Beatriz Kimpa Vita, who was possessed by Saint Anthony. And when she was arrested by soldiers of King Pedro IV, they said, "How can you be Saint Anthony when you're a female?" And she said, I'm Saint Anthony, I'm just in this body," is sort of what she said to them. And I think that's kind of the way that might work. So you have those kinds of figures. Yes, and of course there's a whole cult in the Catholic Church regarding the Virgin Mary. Beatriz Kimpa Vita also made references to the Marian cult. They had people who were representing Mary and had chains on their hands to be a fertility deity. So, you know, I think this is where we're going with women's studies with regards to religion in Africa. The people that get arrested, for example, for practicing Obia, they're frequently women.
Mm.
We don't necessarily know. Unfortunately, this is the tyranny that we have in the sources we have. The people who are arresting are only interested in proving that they're practicing obeah, which is a crime. They're not interested in the details. Nobody makes testimony of the details. Had they been arrested in Spain, they would have asked them that. You know, what were you doing? Why did you do this? What is that doing in there? And you might have gotten more details from it. But I mean, that's probably the best I can say for right now, is that women are suffused throughout the entire religious practice, and we can see this more on the African side than on the American side. Let me just say that in the case of the Congo, the African side is better documented than the American side. So we know more about religious practices amongst Africans in Congo than we do about religious practices among Africans living and deported in Brazil or in Cuba. We only know about them when they get in trouble. They don't speak very much for themselves unless they're in trouble. And so we're always having to use the kind of sources that we get. And then those are in turn filtered by the people who decide what's going to be reported and what's not. We don't control that process. We'd like to control it, but we don't. And we have to, you know, again, we have to take what they give us and work with it the best we can.
Fabulous. Well, it's about 11 o'clock at night in Oxford, I believe. Is it, it's either 11 or 12. Is it 5 hours?
Yeah, 5 hours. Yeah.
Yeah, Barbara, thank you so much for staying up
You're
and
Thank you, John.
for responding to John. Alejandro, thank you for the marvelous introduction. John, thank you for sharing your wisdom and insight with us. It's quite impressive, and it's just always, your work is always so full of surprises. And I'm happy that we could put you and Barbara. I had no idea that you hadn't met. So glad that we could introduce you virtually and put you in dialogue. And we're looking forward to your jointly published paper.
Yeah. Well, Barbara and I would have met in Cuba, I think, a couple years ago, except that Linda took up all of Barbara's time and he never got to meet me. I know you've met Linda Heywood, no?
No. I think that the opportunity to meet was in Mbanza, Congo, when you went to meet the head of a Lumbu, and I was in the forest. When I came back, the day after, they told me you already left. That is 2000, I think 2005, 2006.
I was there in 2002 and I was there in 2007.
2007, yeah.
Okay.
That was the
Oh, you were out in Finda.
Yeah. But that is
you two have begun a dialogue and you have a lot more to talk about. So thank you, everyone. And let's give it up for John Thornton.